And what I wanted to say to start, which I think is actually an interesting way, kind of par for the course, but also might make me a kind of interesting moderator of this discussion. This is a panel that Marcela Valdes was very active in organizing, and it's a topic that she's really interested in. And you know, as I said earlier, Marcela is due any minute now, so she was unable to make it. I'm going to moderate. I'm going to ask Barbara Hofer to possibly jump in if she has some things that she's interested in. I feel a little bit like, you know, the guy who usually covers fencing is now has to cover a boxing match. I'm not a YA expert, and so I'm interested to hear what our panelists might have to say about it. You know, to those of us who are also not experts on YA and may review it and may not review it, but may have a lot of questions about how it's reviewed, about how editors are looking at it in terms of their sections, but also how reviewers freelance are interacting with it as well, or may continue to interact with it in a much greater way than might have been the case certainly a decade ago. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. These are in alphabetical order, but I'm not sure if they're in seating order. Lev Grossman is the book critic at Time magazine and the author of the novels The Magicians and The Magician King, both of which were New York Times bestsellers. And I see that Lev could actually have a much longer biography, but he followed my request and sent a very concise one. So,
that's really
but there are many other things to say about that. Laura Miller, who is right here, is a journalist and critic living in New York. She is a co-founder of Salon.com, where she is currently a staff writer. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Los Angeles Times, The Wall Street Journal, and other publications. And she wrote a last word column in the New York Times Book Review for 2 years. She is the author of The Magician's book, The Skeptic's Adventures in Narnia, which was published by Little Brown in 2008. And she's the editor of the Salon.com Reader's Guide to Contemporary Authors. Ben Schrank, there you go, is president and publisher of Razorbill, an imprint of Penguin USA. Razorbill's books include Jay Asher's #1 New York Times bestselling 13 Reasons Why, the New York Times bestseller Marcel Duchamp with Shoes, don't say that very quickly, On by Jenny Slate, and, Marcel Duchamp with Shoes On by Jenny Slate and Dean Fleischer Camp, and the multiple star review winning an entirely revolutionary image-driven novel Chopsticks by Jessica Anthony and Rodrigo Corral. Ben Schrank's novel, Love is a Canoe, will be published by Sarah Crichton Books, FSG, in early 2013. I have a website address too, if you'd like to check out Razorbill. It's www.razorbillbooks.com. Lizzie Skurnick is the author of Shelf Discovery, a memoir of teen reading. She's the author of 10 books in the Sweet Valley, Alias, and Love Story series, and a former editor at Girls Life magazine. Her work has appeared in or on Jezebel, NPR, the New York Times Magazine, O, the LA Times, Book Forum, and many other publications and outlets she can't remember right now. She blogs at Old Hag, www.theoldhag.com. And Tina Wexler is a literary agent at ICM, representing authors in both the children's and adult marketplace. Prior to joining ICM in 2003, Tina was with the Ellen Levine Literary Agency, Trident Media, and the Carpfinger Agency. She holds an MFA in poetry from Brooklyn College and currently serves on the board of the Rutgers University Council on Children's Literature. So glad you all could join us. One question that I'm simply interested in now is the way that we talked about this panel, we were first discussing it, had to do really with how porous the boundaries are around YA as a genre. YA novels can now include sex, they include alcohol abuse, drug usage, all kinds of good things. I don't think there are a lot of gambling in it yet, but we'll talk about that later. If the useful distinction, yes, if the useful distinction is breaking down or maybe breaking down between YA and adult, I'm wondering how you would characterize any kind of distinction between the two. And you might say something about the evolution of YA as a genre. What is the provenance of YA? When did we first start talking about YA as opposed to children's books or another form of genre publishing? Anybody who wants to jump in, please do.
Well, I can actually speak to that a little bit, which is only because all the books I wrote about in Shelf Discovery, which were from the 60s and 70s, they have more drugs and sex and murder and gambling, I think.
Really?
Oh, yeah, you should read the book. And but I would say probably YA started, I mean, I would put it, there is an official date, but it started around when writers like Beverly Cleary, who wrote books like When the Bough Breaks, which is about a girl who has an early pregnancy, and that would have been like 1962. It was when these group of women writers really started writing about their childhoods, and someone took it upon themselves to publish those books. But it wasn't, I don't know when publishers started calling it a genre.
What did they call Nancy Drew?
It's chapter books.
Chapter books.
Chapter books for children.
Those chapter books are very
I just
old
made
term.
that up, but I think that's what they call it.
And there's a distinction between something like the first Harry Potter book, which is middle grade or MG, and then YA, which would be like, say, Twilight, to use a really familiar example. There is that, I think there was a period where chapter books sort of like, it split,
Yeah.
and the more adult-ish content became YA, and the other one became middle grade.
But am I wrong to think that Harry Potter caused a kind of singularity in the YA world? I never used that phrase young adult, or that abbreviation YA before Harry Potter. That for me is what made it visible as a category.
But Harry Potter, the first book, is middle grade, and that is the thing about that series. I think it's the first time that children's books were getting the kind of attention that adult books has been getting for a really long time. It was the first time it was popular on such a huge scale. But actually, the first one's middle grade. The last one is YA, and I think the difference is that if you're defining YA, part of it is that the point of view is distinctly teen. The age of the protagonist is generally teen. I think it usually works out best if that person is teen. It's not the adult looking back on their teen years. That's not the narrative point of view. But it's also not that very young. There's a certain, if middle grade is looking at the world and discovering it, YA is sort of looking internally and figuring out what's all this is going on, and here mentally and physically and in that way. But that was, I think that was a change in the world of children's books. But in terms of like YA, I feel like the 80s were problem novels, the 90s were.
I think the first. I think the first book that publishing considered YA was The Outsiders by S.E. King, and as I remember the story, The Outsiders is that publishing published her as an adult author because they didn't know how to do anything else, because there were just adult books and children's books, and they just like everything in publishing over a period of like many 5 or 7 years, very slowly discovered that there was a huge audience of teenagers who were coming to her book because it fulfilled the characteristics that Tina just talked about. And that was, she in some ways gave birth to the genre.
Although I think there's an interesting point about that, which is that The Outsiders, of course, is a book about boys and has male protagonists, and the girl in the book, whose name I'm completely blanking on, the Sosha, is really just a figure sort of romantic attraction. And the same with A Separate Piece, with all the Robert Cormier books. Not that, I love men and I love those books about men, but it's interesting because the books that were really devoured in the 60s and 70s and 80s were books with female protagonists. So, not 100%, I think one part of the market certainly understood that maybe The Outsiders was the first YA book, but it did not spawn as many copycat books as all the books with female protagonists, and those were read more often. I mean, there were publishers pumping out books about girl characters by Lois Duncan, and do you agree?
I agree, but I feel like those were they were the problem novels. They had a sort of a message. It was sort of like the girl gets pregnant or the girl gets.
You feel like Lois Duncan had a message? She's like psychic.
No.
The message is you might be psychic.
But I feel like The Outsiders was sort of like that sort of for teens by teens. That feeling maybe more as I don't know. Maybe the books I was reading in the 80s, they just felt more
Preachy?
Preachy.
See, I don't think The Outsiders is so preachy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's why there's any book that schools assign, you know, in that era is very preachy, and they were always like, let's talk about death and friends and loyalty. You know, you really can't talk about that in The Moon by Night, which is about psychic communion with dolphins. And, I mean, you know, they never really assign anything by Madeline L'Engle except A Wrinkle in Time, because it immediately becomes too complex to really handle unless you're a grown-up. So, I don't know, I think The Outsiders is great, but I'm partisan. So, I wrote a lot about it. I'm not against it.
Well, I mean, obviously, one of the things that's made YA so interesting in the last several years is the fact that there's so many adults reading these novels. I mean, and that's such a big part of the market. How has that, you know, affected the way that you look at what YA, you know, can be and can do today? I mean, I'm just curious as to what kind of effect that's had on you, either as an agent, an editor, or a writer.
I'd love Ben to talk about Chopsticks, actually, because that's on my bedside table and I haven't been able to read it yet, and it seems an interesting new form of YA.
Thank you.
So throwing you
well, I think Chopsticks is a book that's told entirely in drawings and photographs, and it was created by this Jess Anthony and Rodrigo Corrales, this true collaboration between a designer and a writer, and we were trying to blur the lines in some ways between a designer and writer as creator of a text. And I'm not sure it would have been, I just want to leap back and say the thing for me about YA that was exciting is about when I came into Penguin 5 or 6 years ago, what I discovered was that major bookstores, including Barnes & Noble, didn't have in the children's section, they divided into essentially 3 categories: picture books, middle grade books, and books, and young adult books. And the discovery, which is not a eureka or brilliant or genius moment, but was a good one for me, was that you could publish kind of anything with teenagers in it, call it YA, and it would sit in sections. So I suddenly felt much freer than my colleagues across the street at Penguin, who were either having to publish romance or literary fiction or this or that, in that I realized that unless anybody came and knocked on my door, I could do whatever I wanted as books, just call it YA, and we were good. And it would have a better, you could have a sort of a better, smoother relationship with the reader, because they just didn't care what the book was about, so they were just embracing it as a book. Whereas adults, of course, for reasons that we train them to, don't behave that way. Now, Barnes & Noble discovering that, much like a supermarket, is chopping up this section into like 6 different little sections. It's a disappointment in some ways. But Chopsticks, the reason I was able to do that was because it's just YA, and we could just do whatever we wanted. So that now I'm seeing on librarians listservs, they're trying to figure out where to put it in the library, graphic novel. But that's why I like YA, because there's so much more freedom.
Who do you think, is it driven by, like, who drives what's called what? Like, who are you kowtowing to, or who kowtows to you? I'm always interested.
It is the headache of having to put, you know, a category in the book. We had a book yesterday, which is we were discussing, which is a guy, a graphic novelist, again, creating these kind of beastie creatures, retelling Moby Dick and other adult tales, and we were trying to figure out what category it ought to go in, because we have to.
But for whom?
Well, I think both librarians and booksellers asked that it fit into a category, and we basically, or I end up fighting that all the time. So for this book, we were like, why don't we call it All Ages? See what happens and where they put it. But it is I think a commercial request back to publishers. What is this? Where do I put it? And then in terms of actual YA, and you can probably speak to this better, my experience is that YA tends to have a romantic aspect, and middle grade tends not. I'm not defending that. I'm just saying.
I was speaking to an agent recently who told me she was complaining about the influence of a big retailer like Barnes & Noble on the actual content of one of her author's books. And her author, I can't remember what the breakdown for middle grade and YA is, but it's like, as with magazines, up until a certain point, the reader is always like a few years younger than the characters, like, you know, like 17 is read by 13-year-olds. So it kind of works the same way. And she had a book that she and her author regarded as YA, but the characters were, I don't know, 14 or 15, and they were instructed by the retailer to raise the age of the character if they wanted it shelved in the YA section, which was really traumatic for the author because of course that changes how you depict the character.
That's remarkable. That's incredible story. Did they change it?
Yeah, I think they did.
Is that something you'd be familiar with, Tina?
Well, certainly there are manuscripts that have come my way that are in that tween category where it's neither fish nor fowl, and we will have conversations of saying, you know, should we age this character down, should we age this character up so it fits more solidly there? But there's a categorical difference between what a 10-year-old boy is experiencing and what a 14-year-old boy is experiencing. Just physically, they're going through different things, and emotionally, and regardless of the content of the book. So it's not as easy as just changing a number, but it can help to make those shelving issues, which is kind of what they come down to. It can make it a little bit smoother, which is, you know, we can fight it as much as we want, but at the same time, it's sort of, you don't want your book to get lost in that no man's land. The industry needs every leg up we can get in some ways. So it's kind of like you have to pick your battles, I guess, of which ones you want to fight. There are some small stores that are very smart, and they'll shelve things in multiple sections, and you don't have to worry about it, but most places aren't going to do that at all.
But do you think a book like Judy Blume's Then Again, Maybe I Won't, you know, which is basically about a kid, I don't know how many of you have read it, but it was really about a boy who's about 14 trying to hide his hard-on and get rid of his nocturnal emissions. But it's a wonderful, charming book. I mean, I'm not doing it, not a lot of justice, you know, it's a great book. But I'm wondering, could that be published nowadays? I mean, a book that really is about what puberty is about for 14-year-old boys.
Well, there was a book about.
There's a lot of books about that.
But he's not even masturbating yet. He's ashamed to masturbate.
One of those books were subject.
Right. There were stomach pains. A lot of stomach pains.
Yeah, exactly.
What I find interesting is the extent to which a lot of the sex now, I feel like, gets sublimated or converted into violence. I find the explicitness of the violence in books like the Hunger Games book reminds me like of nothing so much as the explicitness of the sex in a book like Forever. Because I don't see that anymore. It doesn't cross my desk books like Forever. Whereas, you know, there's a lot of books about kids poking each other with pointy things, but, you know, just metallic pointy things.
I mean, I do think both Forever and Then Again Maybe I Won't much cleaner when you look back at them.
They are not. I did. I wrote a book. They are filthy. They're just filthiest, but in a good way.
But I think in comparison to what we call the paranormal romance for teens, which is extremely violent and sexual in a whole different way than Judy Blume.
Well, but I think that's because it's licentious. I mean, I think it's really the tone of what. I don't think anything filthier, because I read that stuff too, and I think it's just like a porn, you know it when you see it kind of thing. I don't think anything different.
But I also think that paranormal romance, there's the language of metaphor that's being used a lot because of that. Whereas the violence, there's no metaphor there, and it's quite explicit. But I think we've always been more comfortable with violence with kids instead of sexual content. I think in a bizarre way that we completely sexualize our kids, but we don't want them to see sex, but we don't have a problem with them.
We can't hear you. Please
obscure.
talk into the microphones a little slow. Thank you.
Anyway, I agree with your point, I guess, is the gist of what about.
I just don't think that the level of sex or violence is as big an issue in YA as all that. I mean, it's there, but I don't think that that's what makes it popular with adults or is causing as many teens to read. I mean, I think there are issues that adults think about, you know, like, oh, there's too much sex, there's too much violence. But I don't think it's what the actual readers of the books are spending any time thinking about.
Right. I mean, I can say that, to respond to that, the reason that we internally think that adults are really responding to YA, and this is like the great mass of readers, is because we work with writers on creating plots that have a kind of enormous immediacy and pull you in perhaps in a way that is cinematic, and that readers who were also readers, you know, who'd grown up on Harry Potter, which because it's now 10 or 12 some odd years ago, are looking for that same experience in their adult stuff and not necessarily finding it. We're hearing, and so we are still providing that in these YA novels.
And I think it's very interesting the way I feel as though you know, for a long time, literally decades, narrative and straightforward storytelling is a kind of piece of the literary mixing my metaphors. It's something from the literary toolbox that literary novelists have been neglected. I think there's an increasing hunger for storytelling and for narrative that isn't chopped up or concealed or just not there. And I think readers are going into YA for it because they can't find it in you know, literary author TK.
I just did a big piece about the Hunger Games, and so as a result, I interviewed just fans, adult fans living. No, that's a long story. It's not. But at any rate, I spent some time talking to just regular fans. I talked to, you know, like a 10-year-old fan, and I talked to a 32-year-old fan. And the 32-year-old fan was really interesting because she said to me, okay, these are some of the things she said to me. One of her favorite books is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. So obviously she likes this kind of dystopian thing. And then she said that she had been a Twilight fan, and that's one of the reasons why she got into Hunger Games. Then she said that she now reads almost entirely YA. She's kind of moved away from reading adult books. And so I asked her why, and she said that, well, she just found, like the last adult book she had read, and it's a book I haven't read, so I don't know anything about it, was The Memory Keeper's Daughter. And it was just too heavy, and by the time she was done, she was just really depressed. And she just felt that a lot of the adult books that she was reading were too gloomy. And so then I said, okay, but you don't think The Hunger Games is all that? And she said, no, you're right, you're absolutely right. I mean, she was not an unself-aware person, and I just thought it was so funny because I can't imagine anything more kind of bleak than The Road. But I think that these are, you know, this was not like a critic. This is someone who's trying to articulate her tastes. And so it was really interesting to sort of go back and forth with her on it. And she said, you know, at least with The Hunger Games, there's some kind of hope. It doesn't just end in despair. And to a certain degree, you could say that about The Road as well. There's an intensity to the action.
Redemption.
And then there's some kind of sense of some sort of hope at the end. And this was how she expressed her preference. And to me, that was really valuable input, because I think she might even be saying the sort of thing that Lev was saying, that there's more attention to both the intensity of what's going on in the narrative, you know, that she's really drawn into the story. The story isn't just about ruminating on the missed opportunities of life and loss and grief, you know, which is the sort of things that literary fiction tends to sort of dwell on, and so it was both more exciting in terms of plot, and then it had a resolution that was not about despair, but it had some kind of hopefulness, and however dark the story was.
Well, that raises a really interesting question, and something that's very relevant, you know, as members of the NBCC. Are books being reviewed? Are YA books being reviewed with an eye toward adult readers, or are they being covered? Do you guys find, you know, really the review that's focused more on the target audience?
I've definitely reviewed them for adult readers, because I don't know how many teenagers read Salon. But I
never know.
I was specifically picking things that I thought adults would want to read, and that was how I framed the review.
I did the same thing with, I probably were talking about the same book, John Green.
Yeah, it's such a good book.
Yeah, and I just, that, what's it called?
The Fault in Our Stars.
Fault in Our Stars, which came out earlier this year, which I absolutely loved. And yeah, I specifically framed that review as, let's drop the categories for a minute and just talk about an extraordinarily powerful novel that is kind of all ages.
Which doesn't mean that a lot of the YA books that get sent to me aren't, or I don't even get that many, but a lot of the ones that come out are not incredibly juvenile and formulaic. You know, I mean, I would say the vast majority of the ones that I see are. Even ones that people are sending me saying, oh, this is a standout. So it's weird because it's hard to find, for me, it's hard to find the ones that I think are like that. And I only knew Fault in Our Stars because you told me about it.
Right.
I also find that, or whenever I visited schools for my book, that actually the kids are reviewing them themselves. And so the review world is basically kids on these websites I don't even know talking back and forth about the books, and then bloggers who are into YA talking about the books, but adult bloggers. But you know, I was approached to write a YA review column, and then it just got squashed by the publication. You know, and whenever I do review a YA book, it always has to be something like An Odd Duck. It has to be something like Chopsticks for me to sort of sell it. I can't just, which is strange considering that there's an enormous audience for it. But
How big is it? Do you know? Do you have numbers about how many adults are buying YA?
I mean, I think it's a tough question. I think that what we think of as traditional YA, the kind of YA you're saying, isn't any good. Is there's a, you could probably find 1 million people to buy a traditional YA novel that really is, even in my mind, for teenagers for specific reasons, and then a book that crosses over, like John Green's book, like certainly the big ones, Hunger Games, and etc., that is as big as any. I think we can all agree it's as big as any book published today.
Well,
So-
Hunger Games is just huge. Like it's been parked on the USA Today bestseller list, which is the only one that puts all of the ages and the genres together. It's just been living at the top of that list for like a year.
can I say something though also about those books, which is that they seem to me sort of like a, you know, the bastard child of books like Jaws and stuff, where they're really meant to be part of a series that involves a movie and involves fan fiction and involves, I mean, every time I read The Hunger Games and Twilight, I'm always like, I can't wait for this to be a movie so they can cut out half of this extraneous stuff and actually show the restaurant, because the author can't show the restaurant, you know, and I really am looking forward to the Hunger Games books because I feel, because I feel that they'll be able to do, I feel like they're a partnership between the author and the director.
But they're written for people who watch video all the time.
Yeah.
Art, did you have a question?
I want to hear our panelists.
You're just raising your hand.
We are
I
gonna-
have a question about the blogosphere and the reviewosphere.
Well, that's what I want to, yeah, I was going to talk about in
Then
the
I'll-
remaining time. and then we'll-
When I look for information online that I don't already have about a new book of poetry, say, which is what I'm writing, I end up reading the equivalents to Salon and to other publishers and academic sites. What were you expect? When I'm writing about something with a younger audience, I end up discovering, without looking for them, 300 blogs that people are in high school, which have these great green and purple and sparkling backgrounds, where they have 750 book reviews, which, the best of which you wouldn't know except from the paratext, and the worst of which are illiterate, and there's everything in between. If you talk about the blogosphere and the semi-pro review world that has so many young readers in conversations with each other, and do we want to say, let's keep adults the heck out of there, or do we want that to be more articulated to the...
I don't actually think that the really robust blogosphere on YA is teenagers. From the retailers and librarians that I've talked to, there are kids who have blogs, but they don't have a lot of readers. The YA blogs that have the most readers are usually women in their 20s. And they are people who came in through Harry Potter or through Twilight and who now are really into YA, and they're kind of like this woman that I was just describing. She runs a Hunger Games blog, but there are all these other bloggers, and then they're also writing. I mean, one of the really interesting things about YA is that, and Ben is an example of this, like the authors go to work for the publishers, and then the publishers become authors, and it's just, it's sort of a very tight community, and the bloggers are sort of part of that as well.
Also though, and I don't know, I can't speak for Penguin, I can't actually speak for any publishers, but there is a publisher I think are making more of an effort to reach those teen reviewers, because they do have this insatiable desire to express their opinions on everything. And speaking of NetGalley from the last panel, they are, I know that Houghton Mifflin is doing a lot with reaching out to teens specifically and giving them galleys through NetGalley and having them post reviews through either various sites that they're putting it up or having different ways of disseminating their reviews that are teen reviews of these books that they are getting through services like NetGalley, because they need those kids on the ground floor who are going to spread the word and who are going to talk about the book.
Would you say they were more bloggers or like on social networking, like Goodreads or something like that, or teen reads rather?
I think that there's, I mean, certainly I think Goodreads is driving a lot of that for teens, but I don't know that that distinction matters anymore between it being a blog and Goodreads. I mean, it's kind of like, aren't they getting a little bit?
But I think all right, and whatever this is I think the right thing to address it as. And I think all of this is new in the last even just 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I'm not sure for this group it would be right to call what teenagers and these adults reading YA are doing is proper reviewing, because of how we are all speaking. I don't know if it's true in the adult world, but it is true in the YA and children's book community that everybody's really speaking to each other. It's just not a closed community, so someone can start a blog tomorrow and write to writers of books and say, I'd love it if I could review your thing. And the writer, because of the level of access through via all the social networking, can say terrific, and there creates a kind of a circle of goodwill that I think eliminates, and I'm not saying it's bad or good, I just am sitting in my office watching it, but it eliminates kind of a real critical reviewer from that equation for the kind of YA that you're not.
Right. That's too bad, because I was going to have Steve send out a membership form too. But we got a lot of questions. I want to ask just one thing before we turn to the floor, and then how has the success of YA affected or not affected review coverage you see in newspaper sections, newspapers, etc.? Has it had are you seeing more books reviewed? Are you seeing more books covered? How do book review editors classify YA when they're assigning pieces? What sense do you have of it? What that landscape looks like?
I mean, I can just speak. I think it's Pamela Paul at the New York Times Book Review fighting for more space, and I think we're all seeing her children's book review, and I think we're seeing her get it. So it's growing.
Could you see it broken out into a section that's standing alone from children's books at a place like the Times?
I couldn't. I think there's that question about reviewing YA for children and reviewing it for adults, and the difference there. Because I do think ultimately, although you have plenty of adults reading YA for reasons of escapism, kids are reading for different reasons. So I don't know. It would seem odd to me to have a different section, for instance, in the Times that reviews YA seriously for adult readers. Then maybe it should just be adult.
I mean, some people say that the Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which was published as YA in the UK, I mean, at a certain point, here it was published as an adult book, so was that a YA book when it was reviewed here?
Let's take some questions.
Eric, one of the things that I'm seeing in the YA books I review is all the patterns you discussed at the beginning about how there are these really dark topics like adultery and Nazis and whatever. But then when you look at the reading level on them, when doing a readability check, I see it's generally like 3rd or 4th grade reading level according to the standard level, possibly 5th if it's really mature. Can Tina and Ben especially tell us, are YA readers expected to meet a certain readability level on the standard reading scores?
I don't think so. I think it comes back to what it said originally. I think YA, I think that's really interesting. We don't look at our fiction that way. We certainly have writers who write in a very simple prose style, which, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, which we think possibly creates an immediacy with the reader that a more complex prose style doesn't. At the same time, John Green, I'm sure, is writing at an adult level, as are many, many other of our writers. So, I don't really discern that way.
Yeah, I think going back to the history of children's books is that those sort of concerns used to be at the fore when this children's market was driven by school and library sales. And now we've realized, lo and behold, it's a very viable commercial enterprise in a way that never has been before. And those concerns sort of fall by the wayside when you're thinking more in terms of what appeals to your reader. I don't even know that I've ever run, I don't know how to run that sort of a matrix on any of the books that I represent. What does that say? I don't know.
2 questions in the back.
How much do you think the audience to this YA literature, which is the adult part, are reading it because their kids are reading it and they want to see what their kids are reading? Isn't that really how the whole Harry Potter phenomenon? I mean, it's the kid who got the book from another kid's idea, and then the parents want to see, what is my kid so hot about reading? And isn't that, so are there any blogs out there that are specifically for parents who want to see what their YAs are reading?
Definitely. I think that's sort of, your kids are the gateway drug to getting into YA fiction, which is awesome. I think that's why a lot of parents started reading YA, and then they just found it very gratifying because they're really good books. I'm sure that there are plenty of blogs about that. I don't know any off the top of my head, but certainly there's a really rich community of parents who are speaking about the books that their kids are reading and that they are reading. And a lot of parents are finding that a very gratifying experience to read with their kids and having those book clubs, mommy-daughter book clubs, and Guys Read is certainly doing a lot with bringing guys into the reading community and with their fathers or without them. It's a great sort of, perk, I guess, of this rise in this popularity, I think.
Could you say something about YA nonfiction? Is there any crossover to the adult community on YA biography or those books, which I know are out there?
I think there's a lot of demand for YA nonfiction. I think that it's always important for us within the publishing house to remind ourselves that you're speaking directly to an audience that is in school most of the time doing, engaging with nonfiction. So that if we are providing nonfiction for them, it would not be that they're kind of covered in that category day to day in a kind of progressive way. So we do a little bit of nonfiction. I do 1 or 2 nonfiction books every year, but they're not deeply serious nonfiction. Although there's always, if somebody did something great.
I don't think there's hardly any adult readership for a YA nonfiction.
But can I? Wait, I got one of those. I would say though that nonfiction for memoir, YA memoir, is a category that seems to be growing. We saw it at ICM. We had the Burn Journals by Brett Runyon. We had Nick Schaff's memoir that he did as a partnership, not a partnership, but sort of a companion to his father's book. I think that that's a category because if best memoir reads like novel, then we're seeing some growth there. Everything else, I think, like Ben said, it's difficult, but that I think has been an exception to the rule.
I was also going to say, I think the YA autobiography maybe is something that should, not autobiography rather, but biography is something that should be explored more by reviewers. Because it really is, I had to read it just to judge a prize. I didn't even really know it existed, but there's some great book about the Curies, and there's also many, no, it is not. No, actual books. And there's wonderful, wonderful books about the civil rights movement, and I think that's actually probably, I know biographies were the only nonfiction I ever liked to read as a child. So I think that's something publishers could actually find an audience for increasingly if they were aggressive about it.
Any other questions? I'm sorry. I'll take one more, and then we should dismiss for lunch.
Yeah, well, sort of an observation. I don't review YA, but I did notice Chopsticks. I was kind of intrigued by that. I picked it up, and that was right next to a guide to the characters in the Hunger Games, and then I started to read that, and I was thinking, you know, writing today is reduced to 140 characters, and now you have, I don't mind a 32-year-old woman who wants to find escapism, but to have a child of 10 really into this violence, and if they're all sort of being geared towards this extremism, when does it stop being escapism, and when does it just become I don't know. I mean, porn is one thing, that's fine, but I think people, when you're actually hurting one another and being taught to think in that manner with videos and everything else, it's kind of disturbing what our
I
society
think
is
that
becoming.
children who don't like to read that kind of book just don't read it.
You think?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if one is being educated in that way. If you just see, you know, for instance, bookshelf space, if the displays are all, you know, violent books, is that what kids can be trained
kids
to like?
mostly decide what to read on the basis of what librarians, booksellers, and other kids recommend to them. And if they don't like it, they don't. You know, it's not assigned reading. I mean, there's kids who like fantasy novels. There's kids who like pretty realistic novels. There's kids who like these dystopian things, which is the genre at the moment. But that will pass. And I just think that having a panic about that is just historically we've had like a zillion of those over the years, and there isn't a lot of evidence that there's a reason to.
So they'll still be buying biographies as well? I mean, I hope so.
Well, some of them probably do. The ones who like those. It's like anyone else. I think what's more freaky are these adult thrillers with these incredibly elaborate serial killer torture scenarios that everyone on an airplane that I'm with is reading. And I'm in a little tiny can with like at least 50 people who are reading about these tortures, but they actually have never attacked me in all the time that I've been on there.